Hello, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by World IP Review and Aptitex. I'm Peter Scott, Editor-in-Chief of World IP Review. I'm going to be providing just a very short introduction to our topic and some housekeeping before handing over to our main event, which is going to be delivered by the quite brilliant panel you see here on screen. I, for one, am delighted today that our topic is emerging from crisis, brand protection lessons from the pandemic, mainly because it's nice to think that we are, in fact, beginning to emerge from crisis. It's been a long year. And we couldn't hope to welcome a better panel to discuss those brand protection lessons. Just going clockwise, we've got Fred Fellman, who's Chief Marketing Officer from our partners on this webinar, Aptitex. Then to my left as I sit and to my right on your screen, we've got Lisa Widup. She's Trademark and Copyright Senior Counsel at Zoom. Below her is David Kaplan. He's partner at Kilpatrick Townsend. And last but not least, we have Austin Phillips. He's lead counsel for brands and marketing at Facebook. And thanks to all of you, the panel, for joining us, and also to you, our audience. Just a few pointers for you before we start. If you'd like to ask questions, please do so by clicking on the question mark icon on your screen. We'd welcome them throughout the presentation. Also, the webinar will be available on demand for the next 12 months. It is being recorded, so please do forward it on to anyone you think would be interested. I'm going to hand over to Fred now and thank our panel again for joining us. And then I'm going to disappear, but I'll see you guys all at the end, and I hope you have a great panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, guys, for joining. I mean, we have an esteemed group here. Super lucky to have all of you on board. And just, as a further point of introduction, I was lucky to work with Austin at Facebook for a while when I was on the team there, and I was lucky to work with David as he was our outside counsel at that point as well. And I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Aptitex. I was the Chief Marketing Officer of MarkMonitor, and also the Chief Marketing Officer of the acquired entity, which was Thomson Reuters Brand Protection. And with that, I'll give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves, starting with Lisa on my right.
Thank you. So I'm Lisa Widup, and I'm currently the first and only trademark copyright counsel at Zoom. Prior to that, I was at Kilpatrick Townsend for a year and a half, working with David, and for a very short time with Austin before he went to Facebook. Prior to that, I was at Apple for 12 years, where I worked both in the trademark and copyright team, and I also supported the content services legal team. Prior to that, I was at Townsend & Townsend & Crew, which was acquired by, or merged with Kilpatrick. So that's sort of my 20 years in a nutshell.
Nice, Lisa. Thanks. Austin?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Austin Phillips. I am lead counsel at Facebook in the Brands and Marketing Legal Department. In my role, I lead and manage the Instagram Global Trademark Program, including clearance, prosecution, related enforcement efforts, and I also manage an aspect of the Facebook enforcement program as it relates to online app store infringements and brick and mortar real world use cases. Before that, I was at Kilpatrick Townsend, and I worked with Dave and Lisa. And of course, I worked with you, Fred, at Facebook. And so it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm speaking in my personal capacity, even though a lot of that interacts with my role at Facebook. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks.
And I'm Dave Kaplan. I'm a partner at Kilpatrick Townsend, and I lead our online enforcement team. So basically, I deal with these issues all the time. I've been doing it for, I don't even like to say anymore, 20-something years before there was a DMCA. So a long time. And I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Welcome. So today we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to have a brief introduction to the topic. Then we'll speak about the business impact of the pandemic, where we'll talk about how it impacted our businesses or our practices. And then looking briefly at the abuse trends themselves, what happened and what do we think will stick after all of this ends, and then we'll look at the successes and failures from a mitigation perspective, and then talk about the teams that each one of our panelists have to help them deal with this, and then finally the lessons learned. So that's what we'll cover, and we'll have a few slides. I think there are 8 slides at the beginning, and then we'll move on to just a conversation like we've had at the beginning here. So I think this is probably a very memorable moment in cloud-based conferencing this year. And I think many of you may have seen this meme, but the meme itself was pretty funny. This is a court case, and this is a lawyer whose family member must have added a filter to their Zoom video, and they were appeared as a kitten as opposed to a lawyer, and he was explaining to the judge that he was actually a lawyer and not a cat. But jokes aside, cloud-based conferencing really took off, as we know, and we saw pretty extreme growth during this period. And in fact, cloud-based services in general have exploded. I heard this morning, I think it was a Wall Street Journal reporter talking about the investments that were made in cloud-based systems and IT investments that are going to propel growth overall as we come out of the pandemic, and that's pretty exciting news as we look at what we've all been through. And speaking of what we've all been through, it was a time where we had to figure out different ways of interacting with folks, and we all chose different ways to think about how we interact, and that interaction, and as was bridged by online methods, as we couldn't visit and see our friends and family, resulted in pretty substantial growth in social media, and not only did it drive growth in social media, but also drove advertising in social media as businesses learned the power of social media to influence purchase and even to drive sales. And for this, in the next moment, I think we spent a lot of time on these devices in this last year. It's probably no great surprise that they were central to our day, often bridging, the time when we were away from our computers and away from Wi-Fi. We were able to always, get online via our mobile phones, and that in turn drove incredible growth in mobile. In fact, our usage ballooned, as did almost everything that we did online, from entertaining ourselves to socializing to communicating and shopping. And speaking of shopping, if you can only really laugh at this moment, I think all of us probably had a neighbor that we saw this kind of thing going on their doorstep. There were certainly moments during the early pandemic where everything came in this way to me, and as a result, we saw incredible growth. In fact, we saw growth that eMarketer stated as being a 10-year acceleration of the switch to e-commerce and mobile commerce.
And Fred, I just want to jump in quickly and just say, I think the two things are tied very close together. To keep in mind the social media and that the sales are happening in different ways now. People aren't necessarily just going to the retail sites. They're finding it through social media. And wherever you see things leading to market, you see infringement and fraudsters following as well.
You're absolutely right. And I think the other shift that occurred that I think it's important and relevant is that a lot of us started our shopping journey in different ways, either through social or and even directly through some of the platforms. And Amazon joined market leaders Google and Facebook in the advertising as they came in as the third largest place where folks were advertising their business and services. And that's a good lead in, David. So thanks for that. In terms of our first question for the group, which is, what pandemic trends did you observe online, and how do they impact your business, or in your case, David, your clients, and what of that's gonna stick as a result of the pandemic? And maybe we'll begin alphabetically with Austin. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks. Yeah, a big observation is growth of reliance on social media. I mean, obviously, it impacted the business that I'm in. Reliance on not only social engagement with social media, but also for purchases and shopping, as Dave mentioned earlier. I mean, this year has been super wild. I mean, if we could take a moment and think about what it felt like to live in March 2020, it was very uncomfortable, a very dark segue into a new reality of what it's like to live in a global public health crisis, when COVID was new and scary with a lot of unknowns and lockdown orders rolling out throughout the world. Facebook and Instagram were among the safest places to socially distance. Even the word social distance wasn't even a term commonly used or known. And there's a lot of data reflecting this, but I think a lot of us experience this anecdotally, that a lot of people increased their consumption and engagement with social media during the pandemic, almost creating like a new higher level of normal. And I think this is actually going to be one that sticks around beyond the pandemic. And this was trained particularly during periods of quarantining, because there was nothing else to do. So people weren't just using social media for social purposes, but with the whole world shut down, the only place to safely purchase goods was online. So reflecting on the growth of social media reliance, I think it's just as much a story about e-commerce as it is about traditional social media. Lockdown orders across the country, we saw a lot of retail stores either temporarily close or permanently close. And the other ones just scrambled to find an online-only strategy, which also forced buyers to change their buying habits. So I know that this is true for me and my family. Most people in the country felt unsafe in stores. And meanwhile, e-commerce and online shopping struggled to maintain inventory and supplies. So who can forget about how ridiculous it was seeing people stock up on a year's supply of toilet paper? Now that, I hope, is not a trend that goes beyond the pandemic. With that said, I think COVID also highlighted a need to support small businesses and shopping locally. For many, it's still jarring to see the many shuttered small businesses that were beloved, longstanding parts of a community that are now closed forever. So many small businesses, again, to Dave's earlier point, in order to survive, were forced to pivot online, often leveraging social media as a means to keep their business alive. And as I mentioned, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, but I'm really proud of the role that Facebook and Instagram played in this particular part of helping small businesses in the world survive the pandemic. During the pandemic, Facebook created a bunch of tools and services that were intended to help and leverage social media in this way. We created free digital storefronts for small businesses. We offered programs such as the Small Business Grants Program. We created gift cards for small businesses. We increased fundraiser capabilities. We even added easy ways for businesses to announce temporary service changes. So these sorts of programs and services are always good ideas, but in a pandemic, they were rolled out as lifelines. So even as a prominent social media user myself before the pandemic, in 2019, I would have rolled my eyes so hard at the idea of a virtual happy hour. And now looking back, I can't even count the number that I've gone to. And I still attend far fewer, but regularly cadenced virtual get-togethers. So I think we've all observed a massive influx of social media activity, a major reliance on it. So working in social media, all these things greatly impacted the business that I work in.
Like, that's an awesome segue to Lisa. Speaking of happy hours, I maybe attended a few on your platform, Lisa.
Just a few, and organized several. And it's just speaking personally in my personal life. I found before I even came to Zoom was a lifeline to allow me to connect with my friends because they had that free account option, 40-minute limit, that you could just easily set up. It's, pretty intuitive, easy to use, set up a meeting. And I connected with friends back. I grew up in Texas that I hadn't seen in a long time. And this was a great way for us to reconnect. And it's created a new, a monthly meeting that we're going to hopefully have into the future. So just speaking personally, it changed, the way I interacted with my friends, but I know it changed the way a lot of people were able to continue with remote work, with remote social activities, education, government activities, healthcare, as well as social action. With the election that went on last year, a lot of the activities that people would have relied on, knocking on doors and being able to, have phone banks together, they had to kind of rely on, video communications like Zoom to allow them to meet together for trainings and just, supporting one another. So it really was a essential tool, and I think still will be and is. And maybe a lot of people here weren't familiar with Zoom prior to the pandemic, but now I believe it's a household name, which is fun for me as a trademark lawyer, right? So it's been a real rocket ride for the company, and one that's been really excited to kind of jump on board. So yeah, I see Zoom recently came out with a report about hybrid working, now that things are opening back up and people can see, well, hey, we can do this without being in the office all the time. That I think hybrid work is going to be something a lot of companies will adopt in the future as they do start opening up those offices, and that there's a lot of appetite for that, among the companies and the employees. So it'll be interesting to see how it proceeds.
I heard Jen Psaki from the White House talk about the fact that they come into the office and they sit in their offices and they use your platform to actually conduct their meetings within their offices, because they can't they can't go to the Roosevelt room to actually conduct a meeting. It's pretty interesting to hear that. Dave, what have you observed?
So I would say there's been a few big trends. One, now I've had discussions with clients that have never had internet issues, and they just had to move online. And issues that were sort of surprising for companies. Like I had a medical company said, well, they put out somebody had a fake COVID test with their brand on it. And because fraud just follows the infringement. So where it follows the market, and it follows it quicker than regular businesses can. So you'll see a fake COVID test one day. The next day you'll see, a random small shipping company with fake job sites online, and fake job listings. And I've been surprised at the targeted approach of the fraud. Now there's more and more that's really targeted at small groups, and examples are using a individual executive's name on a job listing and making it look really real, but it's not one of you would expect it with the larger companies, but now everybody's dealing with it. And I've seen just a lot of somewhat like what Lisa was saying, just companies who didn't feel like they had to do a lot of this protection on the online world before just have to now, because it's everywhere, and the fraud has gotten more targeted and exploded. And the last thing, I guess the biggest trend, just big picture wise, is that people now have to decide what they're going to take on and what they're not going to take on. And that it used to be an approach that, hey, it's an infringement. How do we get it down? And now the first step is this one we're going to take on?
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Tons of change, ranging from, accelerating adoption of cloud-based technologies to 5G, to advertising, to mobile commerce. It's huge change. And you started to allude to, some of the elements of the next question in your answer, which I think we should dig in a little more depth on, which is, maybe it's a good point to continue, David. So what kind of, new bad actor behaviors appeared in 2020, and, what do you anticipate, continuing after the pandemic sort of comes to a close?
So again, fraud follows the market and follows consumer behavior very quickly. I've learned a lot from teaching my little 8-year-old here and my teenagers downstairs about how they search and how they find things. And, the younger people don't use Google as much, and maybe people are on their phones more. And so they're going to be searching where they are. If they're on Facebook, they may get an ad on Facebook. They may be watching a video on YouTube. They may be looking at TikTok, Twitter. If you were big into politics before the recent election, everybody was on Twitter.
Nobody's into politics anymore, Dave.
You're getting ads, and you're getting market and consumer interaction with businesses, and the fraud just follows that everywhere. And so you just have to, what it has shown me is that your approach to protecting your brand has to have changed. And this is a trend that will continue, because people aren't focusing on desktop search as much as they were. They're searching where they're doing things. The fake site is a big development, where people are setting up sites that are what would normally think of being as counterfeiting or infringement of services. Maybe, I guess you'd call it counterfeit service, but they actually offer nothing. And it's just a completely fraudulent website that are just aimed at stealing your user information or passwords or credit card information. And it's, from the fraudster's perspective, it's cheaper. You don't have to buy any product. You don't have to have products. You just put a website up, you grab any domain name, and you market it through a social media ad, maybe a phishing campaign, maybe a Twitter account. And so the domain name can be, gobbledygook. It doesn't have to be a really bad infringing domain name. And all you need is, 1%, 10% of people clicking on it, and maybe one of those people give you, and you've spent very little money in creating that. And if they catch you, they move on to the next domain name that they have. They just swap it out. So those are the trends that I'm seeing.
Yes.
And I think most of them stay.
I think you hit on something really important there, which is I think bad actor behavior. It's become more resilient and more networked, and the really organized ones really have studied the way that true marketers are able to use social, use mobile apps and mobile advertising and search to drive traffic. And their networks are resilient. So if you remove part of it without actually understanding the whole network, the network almost self-heals because of that. Lisa, do you have anything to add? Any other things that you've seen?
Well, one thing I want to add to what Dave said, it just kind of demonstrates that trying to rely on domain name watches is not going to get these guys, right? Like you need to be able to detect content as far as where your brands are being used. When they're used on websites that have the domain has nothing to do with it. So that's good to know that that's something to look out for. As far as what Zoom has experienced, I mean, there have been bad actors that just didn't really exist before, specifically in the area of what we call meeting disruption, what other people call Zoom bombing or Zoom raiding. Where they get access or codes to a Zoom meeting and come uninvited with the purpose of making a lot of noise, insulting people, being some really abhorrent behavior in many cases. So, our team internally tries to do what they can to create a trusted environment for our customers. But to the extent I can help from a brand perspective, because on social media is likely the place where these people are congregating and sharing data. And I often are using our logo or trademark in order to flag to one another. So that's been sort of a new thing that I have been working on with Aptitex that I hadn't really seen before. And then, with sort of the meteoric rise of Zoom's brand, there are, new areas for enforcement that they didn't traditionally have to get into. I hesitate to say it because I don't want people going online and buying the Zoom University T-shirts that are proliferating on Redbubble and sites like that. So, but that's another area that we have to pay attention to. Make sure that people don't think these are legitimate merchandise. And then another thing we also are paying attention to, because the way people have come very reliant on the Zoom platform in order to support their small businesses. We want to support that, but we also want to make sure they're using our brand properly. So there's a work around that to make sure, Zoom is a brand. It is not a verb or a noun. So, we got to make sure that we educate people about that.
Hopping on to one thing that Lisa mentioned, Fred, it just reminded me, the one thing I forgot to mention is one thing I've seen it grow a lot. And this is it's just an odd area for trademark lawyers and brand protection lawyers, is online mischief, and really impactful online mischief. That's what the meeting interruption is. And I've seen clients who have real, an investment company where people say their service is down is down. Somebody tweets it out and it becomes a huge story and celebrities are retweeting it. And it's just kids having fun that are really impactful on businesses, and tons of that sort of mischief.
It's interesting because you have more novice users who are, susceptible. You have more bad actors because, a lot of hands were idled as a result of, what happened this year. And then you have this mischief and, the whole library of old types of scams that are, everything for new users, everything old is new again. So you see all that again. But Austin, do you have anything to add to what Lisa or David mentioned?
Yeah, when I was hearing them share, I was just, sort of thinking about how, scams aren't anything new on the internet. And when they kind of revealed themselves in influxes based on the landscape at the moment, I mean, sometimes it's an inflection or a reflection of what's going on. So I know on Instagram, there was, a significant influx of specific kinds of scams that weren't new, but in the context of a pandemic and a recession, they kind of take on a new significance about how the user will experience those scams. So some that come to mind are like Instagram romance scams. And you think about the loneliness of being quarantined, the fake lotteries. So there's a lot of people with a lot of economic struggles that might not have been opened or susceptible to that kind of scam before, that were more so now. Same thing with fake investment scams and loan scams, job scams, and an influx in impersonation accounts. And probably one of the more scarier new ones that I hope goes away is fake COVID resources, COVID-related grant programs, COVID relief, those sort of things, leveraging the pandemic as sort of cover for fraudulent activity. And so we saw an influx of those. None of those are kind of new ideas by themselves, but they kind of take a different light in the context of the moment.
Yeah, I mean sadly, history will tell us that every time there's a hurricane, earthquake, or nuclear disaster, or some other tragedy, that there are a lot of not so nice people who are willing to actually try and take advantage of that situation and use every online platform they possibly can to take advantage of unsuspecting folks. It's a sad thing for sure. Well, I think it's a good moment for us to shift to another question. And but just before I get to that, I want to remind the audience that there is a question panel, and feel free to ask questions. You got a great set of resources here on the panel, and please go ahead and ask any questions you might have. But let's start with, we've talked about the economic changes and some of the opportunities that have occurred, and we've talked about some of the bad things that people have done. Well, I guess it's a good time for us to talk about what's been done about it and how we're fighting this. And I'd love to have some reaction from maybe starting with David. What methods have worked and what isn't working?
So I'll start with it's sort of been what we've been forced to do is what I was talking about before, is triaging, figuring out what matters, and that has led to a lot of the other things that have worked and that don't work. So triaging, in my mind, for brands is connecting with marketing and security and figuring out where your real business issues are. Where are we losing business? Where consumers really being hurt? And then where is our business where are our business security or our consumer security at risk? and really focusing on that, because, you know, if you have 1,000 domain names that you want to go after, 1,000 infringements, you just can't do it all. Nobody has the fraud, and the issues always match the budget. They always get up there, right? The bigger companies have more problems, smaller companies have less, and everybody is struggling to figure out the right budget and what they can get and what they can go after. So key is really narrowing down and focusing on what you care about. And then it's understanding that the goal, for the most part, is going to be to stop it, not to win a lawsuit, because, again, budget, we're not going to sue everybody. You know, you may sue a few people, but you're certainly, the approach for brand protection online can't be a lawsuit heavy approach. Otherwise, you just kill your budget now. So if the goal is to get it down, then it's not necessarily establishing your best claim. It's not establishing a trademark claim, a copyright claim, a, CFA, Consumer Fraud and Abuse Act claim. It's getting it down. And so what is the pull that's going to get the infringer to stop? What is the reason a platform might take action on this? If it's hosted overseas, what is my method to deal with it there? And maybe I can't get it down. It's as an uncooperative domain name registrar and unresponsive ISP. And so, well, let's figure out how else I can at least limit the impact. So maybe I'm going to just try and get their US-based connections from the social media companies that are cooperative to take action. Maybe I'm going to sort of try and bury it a little bit. And so it's thinking big picture about how I impact the marketing method of the fraudsters. I also think about really trying to show clients to focus on the subject versus the target. This goes in the other way of, triaging, and, it's, you're trying to limit the amount you spend, but I also think that the more you focus on a network and really impacting it, like hitting 3 different social media accounts and the website at once, so that they really have to rebuild. If a domain name is going to be fungible, their social media may not, because they may have 1 million followers on that social media, or 10,000, and that they have to rebuild if you get that down. So understanding who you're dealing with, where they're located, spending a little bit of effort in learning that, and then attacking. And obviously you can't do that on every case, but thinking about where that's appropriate. And I would say, in terms of the things that are less successful now, a domain name program to stop people from using your mark in domain names is, as the goal, is it's a wasted chase. I think of them as I want a domain name because there's a business reason. That's one reason I want to get it. There's a real security issue with it, and I can't get it down with a enforcement effort, or there's or just it's the only way to impact it. I think if you're thinking about every mark, every domain name that has my trademark in it, it just never ends, because there's so many extensions. So sorry to ramble on.
No, that was good. That was good. Lisa, do you have any follow-ups? Any thoughts?
No, I echo all of what Dave says. I think another sort of consideration, at least, especially when you're in-house, to be thoughtful of, is the potential PR risk when you're looking at who you're enforcing against. Don't necessarily want to go full bore against someone who's going to make a lot of noise, and then it's a problem. So, that it really, it's a case-by-case analysis to determine, how strong can we be here, or should we be? And because you're not just reflecting, what the trademark law allows you to do, but what the brand should reflect. And it could be that your client doesn't want you to be that way. So, yes, it's another thing to always think about.
meet it with the appropriate response. Some of the letters I've seen, are quite amusing. There's some great examples out there of how people responded to folks, and sometimes humor is a good way to interject. And I guess just before I pass off to Austin to address the question, the other thing that we've seen that hasn't worked is traditional domain name enforcement sort of approaches aren't working, because the investigative techniques that worked before in terms of identifying related domain names aren't as effective due to the redaction as a result of ICANN's overreaching reaction to GDPR. So it requires like more complex investigation to actually unwind these scams and technologies. But Austin, what do you have to add to this?
Yeah, well, echoing all the comments that were made, I mean, it could be sort of a cynical or not exciting landscape whenever you kind of think about a holistic enforcement approach. I mean, ideally, there would be some sort of deterrent effect from an enforcement exercise, but based on, this conversation should kind of highlight that it's harder and harder and harder to have an effective enforcement program that accomplishes deterrence and removes the stuff as quickly as possible. I mean, to Dave's point, and Lisa touched on this earlier, it's getting rid of the acute harm that's on the table. There's an endless number of enforcement targets. And so the real strategy is how you prioritize and what criteria is important to the business to kind of inform how you prioritize. And then having a wide toolkit of knowing different ways you can accomplish the goal that you want, and try what works for the case that's on the table. It is frustrating that a UDRP, it feels like, used to be more of a revered tool than it is today. But that's just how it is. And like maybe sending a takedown notice that gets it off right away, saves the day, even though they can potentially just put it up the next day. So it gets to be a little unsatisfying when you look at the long game, but we're here to stop the harm that's on the table and to make sure that we're being good stewards of our budget and prioritizing effectively.
Yeah, which, technology, again, in that case, where you have to monitor, if there are any changes to the domain name, whether it's hosted again or not, or whether there's an MX record on it, or, they're emailing from. There was a parallel question I think was pretty interesting, which came in through the question section, which is how are platforms addressing bad actors using platforms to impersonate company recruiters, HR managers to run recruiting, job check, fraud scams, and I guess those are the ones that say, oh, I've got this company is offering this job. Sometimes the scams are getting people to pay for interviews, or getting paid to get a visa to come to the U.S. or their travel. These scams are often pretty hard on the applicant, and also pretty hard on the brand, considering what happens. And I think, Austin, you mentioned that you might want to take a crack at that.
Yeah, I could speak from a general platform perspective. I don't know which platform the audience member had in mind, but I would say these days it's a combination of both reporting tools that are available on the platform and artificial intelligence. If there's AI available that signals some sort of scam or some sort of fraud, which does exist, right? But I think platforms, given the scale and the amount of content that's posted all the time, rely on people to report it. So I know that Facebook and Instagram have verified signals that should help deter people actually falling for it. But there's trademark claims you can make if they're leveraging branding. There's impersonation claims. There's a bunch of stuff that's against terms of service and terms of use that are available to make a complaint about. And I know we have a very sophisticated system for managing a high influx of those requests, and we address them timely, at least from our company's perspective. But I know all platforms struggle with trying to do the most that they can to prevent this sort of harm on their platforms.
In terms of the platform struggling, it reminded me of something that I wanted to mention last question as well, is when we started in March, when we started with the pandemic, I had one particular website. I don't remember what it was, but it was some fraud. It might have even been one of the COVID frauds. But I wasn't getting the response from the service provider. And so I called my contact at service provider and asked her, what's going on? Why is this taking so long? And she said, well, I'm here at my home. My staff is at their home across the city. My other staff's over there. And we're dealing with 1,000 of these things, right? So not only has the fraud gone up, but their ability and the company's ability, at least at the beginning of this whole mess, was severely impacted. And so the idea of really focusing on understanding how platforms and how ISPs are handling the current issues is super important for a brand owner, knowing that, for example, they have forms, right? And so you can create this really wonderful letter, but not every letter is going to be reviewed by a lawyer. They're going to be reviewed by the staff that all these companies had to get to staff up. And they're expecting the certain words that are required under the DMCA, under a notice. And so the more you can make it digestible by a person looking at that, the better off you're going to be. And expecting that it may take some time and some back and forth with them. That things may not come down right away. You may have to take some time, you may have to make some effort on it.
Yeah. I want to reemphasize something that Austin said, because I think it's really important, which is oftentimes the terms of service of platforms are actually a more compelling argument for the platforms to take changes than trademark or other claims, because most platforms, and especially the ones that are being targeted in this way, which, as you can imagine, are probably LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. They take their terms of service very seriously, and they're trying to create a clean, brightly lit place for people to actually have these exchanges. So they're generally pretty quick to react when some sort of inauthentic behavior of this sort is occurring, and anxious to do something about it. And I guess this is a good point for us to go on to the next question, if we might, which is, as we look at the changes that COVID inspired, one of those was the diaspora of our staff, right? I mean, virtually nobody is in the Aptitex office on a day-to-day basis. We're distributed, all over the country and the world, and I'm sure that's pretty similar for more than similar for Facebook and Zoom and probably even David and his team. So I'd love to hear about how you're structuring your team, both in the context of dealing with this elevated sort of corpus of abuse and these challenges. And so what changes have you made, and how are you structuring your team to deal with this? And maybe we'll begin with Austin this time to talk about how he and his team are dealing with it.
Sure. Well, all of us are remote, and all of us were given a Facebook portal to do all of our meetings. We have a major for VC meeting culture as it was even before we were all sent home, but that's obviously gone tenfold or beyond. So I'll talk a little bit about the structure of our massive army that handles our enforcement and mitigation of online abuse. So we have probably one of the largest enforcement programs in the world. So we have an in-house team of lawyers that manage the high volume enforcement program, and we establish the enforcement priorities, parameters, and strategies for the various portfolios that we run. For me, that's Instagram and part of the Facebook portfolio. And then we work closely with outside counsel to execute on that strategy at scale. So Dave on this call is who I work very closely with on our Instagram app enforcement program, and of course, Fred and Aptitex is crucial to our program as well. And so, but our in-house team also works in close coordination with Facebook's domains team, the team that Fred was on at Facebook before he joined Aptitex. So this team manages and executes crucially important enforcement objectives that are focused on domains and also scams and phishing and a bunch of other nefarious online threats. So some of our work overlaps with that team, but mainly when there's a trademark concern. But our respective teams have their own clear lanes to work within, and then we coordinate on cases where there's overlap. So that team, the domains team, also manages the important relationship that we have with Aptitex, our superstar vendor that carries out our policing objectives. And I also maintain a close collaborative relationship with Aptitex because I rely on them to surface the most relevant targets for action in my programs. On the app side, we set up an enforcement directive of clear parameters that we empower Aptitex to pursue independent enforcement efforts on for things that fall outside of that directive, speaking generally about cases that it's less clear of the infringement, but ones where we still have a solid legal basis. We leverage outside counsel and a sick Dave on them. So this workflow, of course, requires close collaboration with my team, the domains team, our outside counsel, and Aptitex all working together. We also have different enforcement objectives depending on the nature of the infringement or the nature of the functionality of the app or service at issue. There are some apps and service that just have to be taken down, and there's others that can and we do shepherd to a rebrand. And we also have a non-platform component to the program where Aptitex surfaces problematic accounts on Facebook and Instagram that I review and take action as needed. And that work requires close coordination with another department at Facebook that we call our IP ops, and they handle routine takedown requests, responding to a lot of those reporting mechanisms I referenced earlier. So there are many folks involved to execute the very large program that we run.
Wow, it's a big group. It takes a village. I mean, considering that you have billions of users, it makes a lot of sense, though. How about you, Lisa? Tell us about what you're doing.
So I am an army of one. As far as being, the only in-house counsel handling trademark and copyright issues. But so the way I approach it is obviously leveraging outside counsel, leveraging Aptitex, which I started working with this year. And, similar to some of the things Austin outlined as far as, having Aptitex look at the mobile app platforms, at websites generally, at social media, at marketplaces. I'm sure I'm missing one of the modules, but it's crucial for me, right? Like I meet with the team once a week. We look through what they've discovered, and I give them instruction on what we should do. Take these down. Oh, I need to look at this and take this in house because I don't know what this is. So just still because I'm still learning. I'm almost 6 months in, sometimes they're a partner and they're just not using our brand correctly. So that's been really, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm doing without having a service like that to help me. And then, when anything I need to escalate to outside counsel or a foreign counsel, my outside counsel helps me with that. And every once in a while, I'll do a demand letter directly myself, because sometimes it just feels like if they get a letter with a Zoom letterhead, that'll do it, and I can take care of it if I can stay on top of the volume. So that's been key, just to be able to leverage the outside. I also work closely with our trust and safety team, who I mentioned earlier, who are looking at issues like meeting disruption. I work with security, who are worried about phishing and other things like that, and trying to stay coordinated with them because they have their own vendors looking at those specific issues that aren't necessarily brand related. So making sure we're coordinated. And then there's also, I work a little bit. Oh no, I forgot what I was going to say. But there's a lot of different teams that sort of touch these issues. But that's just the enforcement side. I'm doing all the prosecution and clearance as well. So
you mentioned something that was really interesting, which is domain enforcement. Now I've forgotten what I was going to say.
That's what I was going to say about domain names. I'm working with a different team that is handling the domain name portfolio as they're trying to corral these domain names that have been registered over time into one place. So sorry, what are you going to say?
No worries. But let's move on to Dave. What is the team at Kaplan? Excuse me, at Kaplan, at Kilpatrick Townsend. What are you guys doing to organize yourselves in this time?
Well, I'll tell you this is just outside, law firm world practice has been, it's very difficult to train young associates now coming in who have never been in an office with your colleagues, and learning the tricks of the trade and learning how to actually be a young lawyer is difficult now. I feel terribly for them, and you have to spend a lot of time talking with them and training them in ways that are not, in my mind, the best way to learn how to be a lawyer. But in terms of the brand protection, we've set it up so that we have bi-coastal, in the U.S. at least, protection so that we can react, because oftentimes there's a urgent need and it's out now, and if we don't take care of it now, we wait till tomorrow, then tomorrow it's twice big a problem. And so it's understanding that you need to act quickly and having people available to act quickly. But it's also, and one of the big changes in my practice has been working more and more with vendors like Aptitex and others that are in other areas like fishing, or across the board, is understanding that if you're trying to run the best brand enforcement program, you need to be figuring out ways to reduce the spend on in any ways you can. And so using us for an escalation path as opposed to sending all the average notices, using us for really more difficult issues, and low-hanging fruit can go to an automated approach, as long as and teaching people that they need to spend time getting their automated approach up to speed, that none of them are out of the box. Okay, you go and run with it. It's teach Aptitex, teach whatever vendor you're working with how to protect your brand and what's okay for them to do and what's not okay for them to do, and then using using us as escalation or as the nuance case.
Yeah. I just remembered what I was going to say about domains, and something you said that reminded me of it, Lisa, which is, because we don't know who's registered domain names, and because so many different organizations within a company sometimes register things, we have found that some of our clients have issued UDRPs against their own company because the domain name registration has been redacted because somebody went out and registered at one of these other services, or one of their partners did. So they don't know who they're in fact dealing with. So you don't know until you actually receive the UDRP notice that you issued one against against yourself.
Do they have a refund policy at the arbitrator? Yeah.
But it's interesting. I think that's really important. What you guys have actually all talked about, which is having a workflow of actually how you're going to work with your vendors and your outside counsel and your inside teams, your cross-functional teams that actually are also dealing with this, so that it's organized. And you really have to have a plan for this, because if you don't, and somebody's at home working here and somebody's at home working here, you could have some coordination issues. So just really having that. And I think that's a good launching point, which is, and really we have, a couple of minutes probably each to wrap up and talk about, well, what are the lessons that you've learned? And I'll begin maybe with Austin again. We'll go alphabetical by first name.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. Dave made a comment earlier that resonated so much with me thinking about this topic, and so it's worth saying for those on the call that need to hear it. And I'm thinking of brands who have placed a lower priority on online enforcement, or might have found themselves a little flat-footed dealing with online enforcement during the pandemic. But please embrace this idea. The internet is the most important marketplace to police your brand, no matter what goods or services your brand offers. And your enforcement budget should be focused on prioritizing online infringement. That the relevant marketplaces within your online enforcement will differ, and they'll depend on a bunch of different factors that's based on the business. There's no one size fits all. And designing an effective program requires close collaboration with the business and making a program that's scalable. I think online enforcement can feel like an impossible undertaking to have a meaningful sense of success, but depending on how well you can prioritize enforcement for impact, it's possible to effectively mitigate online abuses. So every global brand needs to have a strategy that involves a service provider like Aptitex, one that can carry out routine enforcement activities and surface potential targets for consideration in a cost-effective and scaled way. And with that out of the way, I think the lesson for me, or something that's been reaffirmed, is that enforcement strategies should be like a living document that changes as priorities change. The pandemic only increased the number of bad actors and nefarious online activities. And in many cases, certain types of infringements that maybe were less prevalent or noticed before became bigger problems for your brand. It's important to proactively update what your parameters are, what your priorities are, and what your strategies are based on the current landscape of infringement.
All right. Well, David, how about you? How would you like to summarize?
I would summarize by echoing a lot of what Austin said. First is creating a program, maintaining a program that's proactive and not reactive. So knowing what's out there, and that requires some work on the internal side, is knowing where your products and services are being marketed, because and the ways that they're being marketed, because the infringers follow where the consumers are. And they always have, and they always will. So understanding how people are coming to your services and your products and protecting around that, protecting around the security, and watching that area. However you watch it, you have to be aware. Then triaging, figuring out what matters based on the same information. You're watching it. Not every Twitter account is a problem. Not every Facebook post is a problem. Some things you're going to make a bigger problem by going after. And then last, being nimble, like realizing that your program that's in effect today might not be the same program, likely will not be the same program you have 6 months from now. And there may be a different business priority, and there may be a different market out there, and understanding that the infringers tend to move quickly, and so you need to as well.
Super. Hey, Lisa, anything else to add?
I kind of have to say the same things that they have to say, as far as, when I came into Zoom in November, there wasn't a trademark specialist in the company before, and the company is 10 years old. So it was a smaller company, and they were focused on different things. And so they had trademark issues that would come in, but it was solely reactive. There wasn't a lot of proactivity going on. So when I came in, it was like, okay, we got to be proactive. We got to get this portfolio in gear. We've got to get some enforcement in gear. I need to find a monitoring and enforcement solution to leverage that because I can't do it all. Even though I want to, I know I can't. So that sort of echoes what the others are saying. But if, for people that are watching that are either not trademark attorneys, but responsible for the function of that portfolio, leverage outside counsel and solutions like Aptitex to help you sort of be your team. And same even for, if you are the solo trademark lawyer like I am. We can't all have Facebook.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That's
Well, I don't think I could possibly add any more. I mean, it's such a great panel, and we're so lucky to have you on. So thanks for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back to Peter for close. But thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you all. I found that absolutely fascinating, and mostly I just love the idea that people are sending takedown notices to themselves. I really want to hear more about how that happens. Just a reminder to the audience. Firstly, thank you for coming and listening. Thank you for the question. This is available on demand now, so please do share it with anyone you think would be interested. I'd also ask you to share some feedback. There is a feedback option on your screen, so please do that. And also, if you have any additional questions for Fred or any of the panel, I'd be happy to pass those on. So please put them your feedback too. All that remains for me to say is check out future webinars from WIPR, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Peter. Bye-bye.